The late autumn air in the yard tasted of rust, damp earth, and the metallic tang of coming frost. Under the cold, buzzing glare of a single bare light bulb, Lorena Ashe knelt, her breath caught in ragged, desperate gasps that misted in the chilling air. Her knees dug into the cold, unforgiving ground. "Harder," she whispered, her voice raw, broken, a prayer offered not to a man, but to the hulking, breathing shadow that blotted out the stars before her. "Like you own me." A low, guttural sound answered, a noise torn from a primal throat, a sound of pure, unthinking force. The old wooden porch groaned in protest, under a weight no single man could possibly possess, and in the silent darkness of a nearby window, a tiny, insidious red light blinked. A silent, unjudging eye, recording her final, desperate descent into oblivion. It was a hell of a way to start a Tuesday. I was sitting in my beat, up Sedan, nursing the last of some burnt, gas station coffee that tasted like despair. The night shift had been a long, quiet crawl, and the first hint of a gray, unforgiving dawn was bleeding over the horizon of Oakhaven Township. All I wanted was my bed. Then the radio crackled to life, shattering the peace. "All units attention!" The dispatcher's voice, tinny and tired, cut through the static. "Got a Feifei out in Oakhaven. Caller is hysterical. Says she found her neighbor, female, Doga, in the yard with her donkey." I, Detective Evan Riley, let out a long sigh. For a moment, I honestly considered pretending the radio was broken. I had seen my share of weird in the decaying heart of the Rust Belt. But this was a new level of bizarre. The drive out was a tour through a forgotten America. Rusted out cars on cinder blocks, houses with peeling paint, staring like hollow eyes. This was a town that hope had abandoned long ago. When we arrived, the scene was a tableau from a nightmare, worse than any radio call could convey. The damp morning air hung heavy with the coppery smell of blood and something else, something musky and primal. Even for a squad of cops who thought they were desensitized, it was enough to make your stomach clench. The woman, Lorena Ashe, was naked, sprawled on the muddy ground like a discarded doll. Her eyes bulged from their sockets, a grotesque final expression of shock or ecstasy. It was hard to tell. Dried blood was caked under her nostrils. Her breasts and navel were pierced with cheap tarnished metal rings. The donkey lay beside her, its massive form just as lifeless, and they were connected, locked together in a final, grotesque embrace. My partner, Sal, a good cop with a weak stomach, actually gagged. Captain Holloway, a man who'd seen more dead bodies than I'd had hot meals, had to turn his face away and muffle a dry heave into his fists. "Just another Tuesday in the Rust Belt," I muttered under my breath, the words tasting as bitter as my coffee. "Where the American dream comes to die in the weirdest damn ways imaginable." We cordoned off the area and began the grim task of processing the scene. Our forensics tech, Officer Lai, was unnervingly cheerful as he worked. "Well, this one's for the memoirs," he chirped, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. He started inside the small, dilapidated farmhouse. In the kitchen, near a half-empty water glass on the counter, he found a trace of a grayish powder. "Looks like some kind of aphrodisiac cap," he called out. "A homemade one, by the looks of it. Nasty stuff." His initial, on-site assessment was straightforward and logical. "I'm calling it cardiac arrest for both of them," he announced after a preliminary check of the bodies. "They both ingested some kind of stimulant, likely for their extracurricular activities. The dosage was just way too high." Their hearts literally exploded. I did a slow, methodical sweep of the property myself. The house was surprisingly neat, almost obsessively so. Dishes clean, clothes folded, a stark contrast to the chaos in the yard. A single framed photo on the mantelpiece showed Lorena with a smiling man, both looking genuinely happy. It felt like a relic from another life. Outside, there were no signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no footprints other than our own. It all pointed to one sad, pathetic conclusion: accidental death. I wrote in my preliminary notes, the words feeling hollow. Sal shook his head, looking at the scene. "Damn," he mumbled, his voice thick with a mix of pity and disgust. "That is one way to go out with a bang." I was ready to write it off, to close the file, and try to forget the images seared into my brain. I gathered the initial reports, the grim Polaroids, and the coroner's preliminary findings. The victim was Lorena Ashe, 42. 3 marriages, 2 acrimonious divorces. Her third husband, the man from the photo, had died in a construction accident 2 years ago. After that, she'd cashed in the insurance, moved back to this rural plot, and started a small donkey farm. A lonely woman's strange hobby, I'd thought. I wrote up my report, my language clinical and detached, concluding it was a tragic, if profoundly bizarre accident, a case of misadventure. I submitted it to Captain Holloway, expecting a quick signature. The next day, he called me into his office. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and old case files. He didn't say a word. He just tossed my report back onto my desk. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud. Rejected, he said, his voice flat. Cap, the evidence is all there. I started to argue. No struggle. Drug overdose. It is an open and shut case of. It is a case of you not looking hard enough, Riley. He cut me off. In the file, tucked behind my neatly typed report, were 2 new items. A lab report I hadn't seen yet, and a close-up high-resolution photo of Lorena's lower abdomen and pelvic region. I was mid-bite into a stale donut, and the image filling my monitor nearly made me choke. It was so clinical, so invasive, it felt like a second violation. What the hell, Cap? A little warning next time, I managed to say, pushing the donut away. He just tapped the photo on his screen with a thick finger. You looked, Riley, Holloway said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. But you didn't see. Look again. I leaned in, forcing myself to study the gruesome photograph. In my initial report, I'd noted them, a series of tiny dark specks scattered across her lower abdomen, from her navel down to her groin, and a similar pattern across the small of her back. I had dismissed them as a bad skin condition, maybe the lingering scars of some nasty STD. It fit the narrative of a reckless life, but Holloway had the lab enhance the image, sharpening the pixels, until a hidden truth emerged. The specks weren't random. They formed faint, deliberate patterns. They were the ghosts of removed tattoos, the scarred tissue left behind by a laser, and they formed words. I had to read them twice to believe it. Across her abdomen, the faint lettering spelled out, I am master's bitch. Across her lower back, another sentence, I am a slut who begs to be violated. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a kinky accident. This was a story of degradation, of ownership, of a past someone had tried and failed to completely erase. This wasn't a case anymore. It was an archaeology of a ruined soul, and someone, I suspected, had just finished the excavation. This new, disturbing revelation changed everything. The case file felt heavy in my hands, weighted with secrets. I drove back out to Oak Haven, the gray, depressing landscape now seeming to hold a darker promise. I went back to Lorena's neighbors and friends, this time armed with a question that felt impossible to ask. How does a woman with master's bitches scarred onto her skin become the person you described? Old Mrs. Gable from next door clutched a floral handkerchief, her eyes welling with genuine tears. Lorena. Oh, she was such a good girl, she insisted. So hardworking, always offering to help with my groceries, running that farm all by herself. She was an inspiration. Such a terrible, terrible shame. Her best friend, a woman named Sarah, who ran the local diner, was more defensive. Listen, Lorena was a successful, independent woman, she said, wiping down the counter with a cloth. Confident, strong. That is how we all saw her. Whatever she did in her private life was her business. Even the old woman at the village general store, a notorious gossip, had nothing but praise. A real beauty, that one. And made her own money too. Not many can say that around here. How could she die like that? It is a crime against God. The disconnect was a chasm. A successful, independent pillar of the community, who secretly saw herself as a slave, a thing to be violated. I wasn't investigating one woman. I was investigating 2, locked in the same body. And one of them, I was starting to believe, had gotten the other one killed. The case was officially reopened as a homicide investigation. The accident theory was dead and buried. As I was digging through the mountain of contradictions that was Lorena's life, the full toxicology and serology reports came back from the state lab. It was the bombshell that blew the case wide open. Holloway called an emergency briefing in the dead of night, The air in the conference room was thick with exhaustion and anticipation. He stood in front of the projection screen, a fresh cup of black coffee steaming in his hand, looking like a grim reaper in a cheap suit. The first image he put up was the grotesque crime scene photo, making us all relive that morning. The medical examiner confirms the victim had sexual intercourse within hours of her death, Holloway began, his voice cutting through the tired silence of the room. But here is the kicker, the detail that turns this whole circus upside down. He clicked the mouse. The next slide was a single stark line from the lab report, highlighted in yellow. The semen found in the victim's body was human. A stunned, collective silence fell over the conference room. You could have heard a pin drop. Human. The entire scene, the grotesque tableau with the animal, was a lie. A fabrication. It wasn't a tragic, kinky accident. It was a meticulously staged murder, designed to disgust, to mislead, to make us close the file and walk away. And we almost had. The revelations kept coming. Each one another nail in the coffin of the accident theory. There is more, Holloway said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He was enjoying this. The unraveling of the lie. He clicked to the next slide, another highlighted line from the toxicology screen. The substance that caused the cardiac arrest in both the victim and the animal wasn't a common aphrodisiac like horny goat weed or Spanish fly. He paused for dramatic effect, letting his gaze sweep across